The webinar is now live.
Do we need to, okay. Dr. Kim will go first, right?
Yeah, because Mohinda suggested last night.
Yes, yes, of course, yes,
yeah.
I don't, so.
여기 어지간히 들어온 것을 알람을 얼마나 있으면 들어와? 한 2분? 3분 있으면 아나? 뭐 몇 명이나 들어와 있는 거 볼 수 있나? 몇 명 정도 들어와 있나? 지금? 13명 들어왔어. 오, 그래. 나중에 이제 여기 숫자 조금 더 되면.
Cannot hear you.
Participants are in now.
Yeah, for now we'd better start. Huh?
Yes, please start.
Speech. 됐어? Okay, let's start. Welcome everyone. Dear sisters of the International Council of Women and honorable leaders from all over the world, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Jeong-Soo Kim, President of the International Council of Women. On behalf of the hosting organization, I would like to welcome all of you and thank each of you for taking time to participate in this event on the theme of violence against women and girls and COVID-19, policies and practices needed to build back better. Our world has been impacted in unimaginable ways by the COVID-19 pandemic, which quickly became a global economic and humanitarian crisis. This pandemic has also increased existing gender inequalities in our societies and has aggravated all forms of violence against women and girls. WHO's latest report on gender-based violence showed the highest rates of intimate partner violence in the past 12 months being against women aged between 15 and 24. Women are entitled to the equal enjoyment and protection of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. In the context of the CSW65 priority theme, we note that gender equality and women's full and effective participation cannot be realized as long as women and girls' lives are overshadowed by violence or the threat of violence. Post-COVID-19 recovery plans currently underway present an opportune moment to implement policies and practices to eliminate gender-based violence and to promote gender equality and women's empowerment. The objectives of this 90 minutes virtual panel are bring together experts from the United Nations, World Bank, and the OECD and others to share their understanding of best practices for building back better post-COVID-19, and also to highlight some of the challenges to eradicating violence against women. I expect we will have a very fruitful discussion today through active participation in sharing our own thoughts on how to eliminate gender-based violence. I give my sincere thanks to wonderful speakers for today's event. They will provide some concrete strategies and ideas about how to fight against the violence toward women and girls. I also thank all the participants today. Now, I'll take a great pleasure in introducing Ms. Linda Liu, first Vice President of International Council of Women, who will be moderating our event today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kim, for your introduction. Welcome to our event, Violence Against Women and Girls and COVID-19, Policies and Practices to Build Back Better. Before we start, I would like to announce some housekeeping matters. This webinar will be recorded, and please send your questions or comments through the chat. As Dr. Kim has clearly pointed out, COVID-19 not only amplified the various inequities faced by women, but also led to an increase in violence against women and girls, an unwanted consequence of women being locked in with their abusers. It is thus urgent and important to find the best policies and measures to combat and end this shadow pandemic. As governments plan post-pandemic recovery programs, it is also an opportune time for the governments to include ending VAWG as one of the core goals in their recovery actions so that they can build back a better world that is safe for women and girls everywhere, including in their own homes. It is our pleasure to invite a group of experts to speak on the policies and best practices needed to prevent and end violence against women and girls. In this webinar, we also want to take you beyond the policies and numbers and hear from the stories of two activist survivors so that you will have a better understanding of the issue and its root causes, which are important for designing measures to end VAWG in all its forms. Due to time zone differences, two of our speakers, Dr. Dubravka Simonovic and Ms. Diane Arango, who are both currently in the US, send their apologies for not being able to join us live, but they have kindly provided pre-recordings of their presentations. We will start with the presentation of Dr. Dubravka Simonovic, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on violence against women and girls and its causes and consequences. Dr. Simonovic was really hoping to be with us today, but can't because she is at the UN where it's 3:30 in the morning. She also needs no introduction, but I'm sure you would be interested to know that she has served in the area of human rights for more than 20 years. During her diplomatic career at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Croatia, Dr. Simonovic served as the head of the Human Rights Department and its Minister Plenipotentiary at the Permanent Mission of Croatia at the United Nations, during which time she also served as the chairperson of the United Nations CSW for 2 years.
Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, its causes and consequences. As the first response to COVID-19 pandemic and increased media reports on increase of gender-based violence against women, I have issued press statement on 27th March 2020 calling on states to continue to combat domestic violence during the COVID-19 pandemic by maintaining and adapting protection measures and services needed for victims of gender-based violence. I have noted general lack of information and general lack of data on increased gender-based violence during that period. And on 9th April 2020, I issued a call to all relevant stakeholders for submissions on data and information on availability of services like shelters, protection orders, helplines, and situation of women during the COVID-19 pandemic. As a result, I have received 274 submissions, and based on those submissions, I have elaborated my report to the United Nations General Assembly that was presented in October 2020 on the intersection between the COVID-19 pandemic and pandemic of gender-based violence against women. From numerous submissions, it was clear that during the first period of COVID-19 pandemic, there was general lack of gendered response by states in addressing and preventing gender-based violence against women and girls. In many states, protection services like shelters were not seen as essential services, while they are and they should be seen as human rights based obligations. They are based on obligations outlined in the United Nations Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, also CEDAW Committee's General Recommendation number 35 on gender-based violence against women, in which elaboration my mandate participated. And also I have, in that respect, elaborated in 2017 report on human rights-based approach to integrated services and protection measures on violence against women with focus on shelters and protection orders, in order to send a clear message that such services are essential human rights obligations with respect to prevention of violence against women. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, we have also seen different level of participation of women in COVID response design and response plans. In some states, women were included in a leadership role, but in majority of states, women were largely absent from local, national, and global response teams. Some countries have undertaken the necessary steps to ensure that essential services continue to operate, and they have adapted those services to pandemic safety requirements, while many others have closed or scaled back such services as shelters and have cut the financial support provided to civil society and women's organizations that operate such services. Restriction of movements imposed in order to contain COVID-19 pandemic have left thousands of women and girls victims of domestic violence trapped at home, a place of fear where psychological, sexual, physical, and economic abuse was taking place. Also, women belonging to disadvantaged and marginalized groups, including women from indigenous communities, migrant women, older women, women with disabilities, they faced increased intersectional forms of discrimination during that period. For those women who are already in abusive situation, their situation has been exacerbated by this crisis, and they have now been left more exposed to increased control by their abusers, while their legal and social support networks have been reduced, or in some cases they never existed, making it impossible or difficult for them to seek immediate assistance and protection or to escape domestic violence. In some countries also, even before COVID-19 pandemic, many shelters were already under-resourced and had limited capacity. In some countries there are no shelters, so there are no such safe spaces for women. In many states there are also helplines for victims of violence, but they are not available 24 hours, 7 days a week, or they are not free of charge. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, they were really needed, and many helplines have reported increased number of calls. So in my report, I have highlighted some good practices. In some states have adopted measures to support women victims of violence during COVID-19 pandemic specifically. So they have included different online services, like e-protection orders. Then many states have established also alert systems for reporting domestic violence at food stores or in pharmacies. Then some have uh, allowed hotel accommodation where shelters were full, and those are good practices that are showing that we need that type of response from states. The COVID-19 public health crisis has negatively affected sexual and reproductive health and rights, and some governments have restricted reproductive health services by determining access to abortion services as non-essential medical procedure. So it is something that was changed after first period, and such services should be also seen as essential services, especially in situations of rape and abuse. In general, with respect to data, there is a lack of comparable administrative data on gender-based violence against women and girls, which make it difficult to evaluate the extent of increase of gender-based violence during the COVID pandemic. But many states are now reporting increase, and as a special rapporteur on violence against women, I have focused on collection of data on femicides. So in past 5 years, I have called all states to collect femicide data under 3 comparable categories: and the category of intimate partner killings and family-related killings that are based on relationship between victim and the perpetrator. And such categories, for example, intimate partner killings in a context of domestic violence, are revealing that out of all persons killed in that context, more than 80% of victims are women. So for those states that had such data, for example, on intimate partner femicides, they would be able to compare this data with data collected during the COVID pandemic period, and they will see a level of increase of such femicides. And now we do have reports from states that there was increase. So this is something that we have to follow up. Now, going back to your question, what policies and practices are needed to eliminate violence against women and girls and to achieve gender equality as we build back better? I would recommend human rights-based approach and accelerated implementation of international human rights instruments on elimination of discrimination and violence against women and girls, including recommendations of my mandate of Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. In my thematic reports, I have recommended many important measures related to elimination of violence against women and girls. So I hope that we should build back better using the human rights-based approach. Thank you.
Thank you. In her presentation, Dr. Simonovic has pointed out that during the pandemic, there was a lack and reduction of gender responses to the pandemic because protection services like shelters and medical care for victims were not seen as essential services. And also that women were absent from some of the COVID response teams in some states. She also highlights the importance of collecting data and recommends that policies to build back better should be based on the human rights approach. She also shared that many of her recommendations can be found in her recent thematic report on COVID and the violence against women. Our next speaker is Ms. Hilary Gebedema, who is joining us live. She comes from Ghana and is current member and immediate past chair of the CEDAW committee. A lawyer, a training specialist, activist, and gender consultant, she is also rector at the Law Institute, which is Ghana's premier vocational legal training facility. She received her LLM from Georgetown University and has written many papers and case studies on issues relating to violence against women. Hillary will speak to us today on the main challenges in eliminating gender-based violence as we move forward from the pandemic and how implementing the CEDAW Convention can help end violence against women and girls as we build back better. Please, you have the floor, Hillary.
Thank you very much. I hope I can be heard clearly.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And it is an honor to join and another one to speak after Ms. Simonovich. I identify with everything that she has said. And what I have to say builds on it. In fact, we worked together on the CEDAW committee, and everything she has laid the foundation that resonates with what my presentation will be about. I will look at how the implementation of the CEDAW Convention could help violence against women as we build back better after the pandemic. And what are the main challenges preventing the elimination of gender-based violence as we move along? I will look at how violence against women runs through the convention and the core obligations of states, some of the challenges, our own jurisprudence, and the COVID pushback. We begin with the concept of equality and non-discrimination. In fact, this was mentioned by Ms. Simonovich in her presentation. I would say, and I keep saying, that had the CEDAW Convention been implemented fully, and the concept of equality and non-discrimination as espoused in our Articles 1 and 2 upheld, we would have had a totally different picture. So one may then ask, what is the link between the concept of equality or non-discrimination and violence against women and girls? Our General Recommendation 19 says violence against women is a form of discrimination. Therefore, if we had complied with non-discrimination, the incidence of violence against women would be very drastically reduced. And it continues that it's discrimination against women because it is directed against a woman because she is a woman. And it affects women disproportionately. And then it includes acts that inflict mental, physical, sexual harm or suffering. And our recommendation says that gender-based violence may breach specific provisions of our convention, whether or not it is specifically mentioned. Our General Recommendation 35, which Ms. Ivanovich also referred to, adds the dimension of economic violence. And General Recommendation 19 notes that this discrimination against women is rooted in traditional attitudes by which women are considered subordinate to men or having stereotyped roles. And so this is the link between non-discrimination and violence against women. Now, in looking at violence against women, the committee looks at it throughout the thematic articles of the convention. So we do not just look at what people initially see, physical violence, but in looking at the other aspects of violence, we note that other articles of the convention, for example, apart from Article 5 that would look at stereotypes and the physical forms of violence that we tend to see, we look at other articles, including Article 6, which is on the exploitation of prostitution and trafficking. We look at Article 10, violence within the educational sector. Article 10 is the educational article. We look at Article 9, that is nationality, and note how the absence of nationality documentation can lead to violence. So all these are relevant in the context of COVID, migration, people's status, women's status, and so on. Article 11, employment. Article 12, healthcare, which is at the heart of the pandemic, and that women's physical and mental health generated by isolation, restrictions, are also critical areas we should look at. Article 13, impact with violence, is seen in the lack of access to social and economic benefits and that resonates with economic violence. 14 rural women, exclusion and the lack of services. 15 and 16, access to justice and family life, again, at the heart of violence. So we note that violence against women, gender-based violence, results in compromising the right to life, security of the person, equality and protection, and is an impediment to the highest achievement of physical and mental health. We also refer to the core obligations of states, that states must exercise their due diligence obligations and bring to book all actors, private and public, throughout the territory of the state. Our general recommendation 28 on the core obligations of states says it should be done without delay. That means immediacy. It doesn't allow for purposely chosen incremental interventions, and a delay cannot be justified on any grounds, including political, social, cultural, religious, economic, resource, and otherwise. Where there is a constraint, states must seek technical and other expertise. So this is the lie of the land, and this is the obligation of states. How is it played out in the pandemic? We issued guidelines to states on violence against women during the pandemic. And this is what I call the COVID pushback. We say that states should ensure that they do not directly or indirectly discriminate against women and girls, and they should protect them and ensure accountability and socio-economic empowerment and guarantee their participation in decision-making in all crisis responses and post-recovery efforts. So we note that the restrictions on freedom of movement for women do not have the gender lens, exactly what was spoken about earlier. In many parts of the world, including mine, women's activities depend on outdoor activities, depend on collecting together the activities in the marketplace, the involvement in catering and such ventures. The informal sector is an outdoor sector, and therefore this impacts them disproportionately, especially disadvantaged groups of women. So our guidelines say that for health, for example, Article 12, the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on women's health should be addressed, and resources and funds should be addressed. We look at their caregiving roles, the high representation of women in the health force, and the increased risk to the COVID. We ask for early detection, protection from contagion through dissemination of information, and the provision of sexual and reproductive health services and essential services, which were shelved in order to address the COVID pandemic. The gender-based violence dimension directly has been spoken to by the special rapporteur, and we ask that perpetrators should be held accountable for such violations. There should be specialized increased security, especially in rural communities. Again, the issue of mental health and safe quarantining and access to testing. Now we will be talking about access to vaccines also. Now, women in decision making, we have also flagged that in the guidelines that there should be equal participation of women, including representation through women's rights organizations in the formulation of COVID responses and recovery strategies, including social and economic recovery plans. Now, let's come to education, where we recognize women as learners, women as workers in institutional representation, and schools as safe places for ensuring that girls' and women's integrity are retained, thereby preventing early marriages, the provision of sanitary conditions, preventing pregnancies, harmful practices, and preventing girls from being used in domestic and economic activities, as has been happening during the COVID when schools were on lockdown. We ask that subsidies be redirected to ensure that this gap does not increase. Am I okay for time? What's my limit now? I think 2 more minutes, right? Yes,
I
okay.
think so.
So I'll quickly try and wrap up. The socioeconomic sector is critical. And we ask in our guidelines that socioeconomic support be given to women already in low-paid jobs, informal, temporary jobs. Gender inequalities in employment should be addressed. Transition women from the informal to the formal sector, economic resuscitation, recovery plans, diversification, stimulus packages, access to markets are very important if we want to prevent violence against women in this sector, disadvantaged groups of women. If we want results, we must be particular. And we list there a whole group: girls in poverty, refugees, internally displaced, minorities, LBTI, in detention, deprived of liberty, women, human rights defenders, and so on. And then the institutional response is critical. The national women's machineries, the national human rights institutions. Quickly to the challenges, mainly the political will, the shrinking resources, the restrictions on movements, women's relegation to their domestic fears, and the economic constraints. We identify with all the provision of services that have been withdrawn. And finally, I will say there is opportunity. There's an opportunity to build back better by women mobilizing, using the pandemic as an entry point, resuscitating the human rights approach, and mobilizing, advocating for change globally and locally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hillary, for giving us a lesson on CEDAW so that we can have a better understanding of this important convention and the rights of women to demand a seat at the decision-making tables, and also to be equally included in all the programs and services that governments adopt for the people. Next, we will have the presentation from Ms. Diana Jamina Arango, the Senior Gender-Based Violence and Development Specialist at the Gender Group of the World Bank. In her career, Diana has focused on gender-based violence in humanitarian and development contexts, working at the Global Women's Institute at the George Washington University, UNFPA, and Pan American Health Organization, and UNHCR. She obtained an MSc from the London School of Economics in Anthropology and Development, and has on-the-ground experience in several countries in every region of the globe, including her home country of Colombia. In her presentation, Diana will share with us the various ways in which the World Bank is helping countries to build back better.
Hi, my name is Diana Arango, and I'm a Senior Gender-Based Violence and Development Specialist at the World Bank. Thank you so much for having me here today as part of this panel to speak to you about how the World Bank is responding to violence against women and girls throughout the COVID-19 pandemic response. From the outset of the pandemic, we decided to partner with governments and UN institutions to address violence against women and girls, as we heard early on that the violence that women and girls were experiencing was increasing. Policies that were making women safe from the COVID-19 pandemic were often putting them at increased risk to experience violence in their home. For that reason, for example, in DRC, we partnered with UNFPA to conduct a rapid analysis to see where gaps in services were. We made sure that those gaps were closed. We made sure that PEP and emergency contraception delivery was uninterrupted, and we strengthened one-stop centers and hotlines where women were turning to after experiencing violence. In other countries like the DRC and Peru, we also worked with the government to strengthen hotlines and to enable women to seek services in areas where they traditionally hadn't sought them before. For example, in Bogota, Colombia, gas stations were converted into safe places where, with a safe word, gas attendants would know that a woman or girl was in need of a referral to a safe service. In Uganda and Peru, we also made sure that we worked with the government to increase communication efforts to enable women and girls to understand that services for their support were not going to stop as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. With cartoons and innovative drawings, communications through radio and TV, we partnered with the government to make sure that every woman and girl knew she was not alone during this pandemic. In addition to those types of efforts, we've also gone much bigger and much deeper in countries like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, India, DRC, and Zambia, where we committed as part of our COVID-19 response to actually strengthen and build back better health services, both ensuring that physical and mental health services were available for survivors of gender-based violence. This often means increasing the quality of service provision to even a better place than it was pre-pandemic. We have dedicated funding through our operations with governments to make sure that this increased quality service provision through the health system that also encompasses mental health service provision is a priority as part of the COVID-19 pandemic response. Finally, we are also working to make sure that any operation that we undergo during the COVID-19 pandemic is not impacted by sexual exploitation and abuse and sexual harassment. To do this, we're making sure that we assess opportunities for sexual exploitation, abuse, and sexual harassment and put in place important mitigation measures to prevent sexual exploitation, abuse, and sexual harassment from happening in the first place. The World Bank more broadly is committed to responding to violence against women and girls throughout all of its sector work, both before, during, and after this pandemic. We have work to support violence against women and girls prevention and response in sectors like energy, transport, water and sanitation, and other traditional sectors like social protection, education, and health. Through this commitment, we hope to increase the funding available to strengthen services and prevention efforts for women and girls and to reduce their experiences of violence against women. So in many ways, the World Bank is committed during the COVID-19 pandemic, increasingly so, and we see that we will continue to be committed in the years to come. Thank you so much for inviting me.
I would like to thank Diana for telling us about the important commitment and contributions of the World Bank to working with both governments, institutions, and private sectors to help countries work to end violence against women and girls in their efforts to build back better, as well as giving us some best practices like providing safe service and referrals in gas stations and using the media to increase awareness of services, of the provision of services. Our next speaker is Ms. Griselda Grootbloem, who will share her incredible story with us. Coming from South Africa, Ms. Grootbloem is a survivor turned activist, committed to helping survivors of the sex trade who seek to exit and rehabilitate their lives. She worked with Embrace Dignity, where she found the opportunity to work on legislative reform on the issue of prostitution in South Africa. She published her first book called Exit, which was nominated for Book of the Year in 2017, on her experience as a victim of trafficking, rape, and drug abuse. Ms. Grootbloem addressed the United Nations General Assembly in 2016, which contributed to a global plan to combat trafficking. She is the founder of Survivor Exit Foundation, which aims to heighten awareness of injustices in the sex slave industry and is currently working on protecting vulnerable young girls from becoming victims of human trafficking and sexual violence. Let us now hear her story. Ms. Grootbloem, you have the floor. She was having trouble with her power, and I don't know if she is able to join us.
She's trying to connect by phone, I believe.
Oh, okay.
Griselda.
Are you able to reach her?
I've not heard from her.
She did send a message to chat saying that she lost her power.
She said it came back on.
Okay.
Shall we switch
Well,
it?
Well, while we're waiting for her to get on, I'd also like to welcome some of the gentlemen who are on our audience.
Good.
So she's still trying to get on. Great. Hello. We
Hi.
lost you. Hi.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Can everybody hear me clearly?
Yes.
Oh, wow. Thank you. I'm so excited to be back here. I almost gave up because of load shedding, but it's an honor. And I'm so excited to be amongst great women. Thank you.
Yes. Please, you have the floor. Please tell us your story.
Thank you very much. My name is Griselda Grootboom. I am from the Western Cape, Cape Town, Khayelitsha Site C. I grew up on the streets of Cape Town as a homeless girl due to the apartheid that took place in South Africa. The government took the District 6 and caused us to be homeless. We grew up there with tennis, glue. We got to learn about gangsterism. We had an opportunity to be in a shelter which was in the central of the whole town during the space of apartheid. We were one of those kids that ran with Nelson Mandela and pickpocketed people on the parade. And because of the law in South Africa, when you're in a shelter, when you turn 18, you have to leave the shelter. And through that, I met a friend. And when I met her, she was through sort of me going to school and we walking through Cape Gardens because there's like this heavy flow of different schools. And we had drugs and that's how we met. We started to smoke together, get to know each other. She came from a very wealthy family. She just had a drug issue. And then the same year she was moving to Joburg and I asked if I can come and stay with her too because the shelter is kicking me out. And with that is when I traveled and met up with her in Joburg. And when we got to Joburg, it was the part that really confused when we had such a full, perfect agreement in Cape Town that I'm going to join her and prepare to change my life with her. She came to pick me up in Park Station. I took the train to Joburg and she picked me up and then she drove me to Yeoville. When we got to Yeoville, she showed me into a room which had nothing inside, which I understood because she also moved up. And then she said she was going to give me food, and that was the last time I saw her. I took a nap because she was going to get me food. And with me taking a nap, guys walked in and started kicking and undressing me. They injected me with sort of a drug that was crystal meth behind your knee. Through the veins, so your lower body can become numb. And with me just thinking maybe the same thing is happening to her, or I don't know what this is all about. My whole body became numb and, men started to come in and just found pleasure on my nudity. This would probably went on to 2 to 12 days because every day it was different sexual exploitation of clients. And eventually I got kicked out of the house in the middle of the night. They brought a younger girl in and that's how I became a prostitute on the street of Johannesburg in Hillborough and Berea. My exit was basically going from one brothel to another. I got sold to a brothel in Port Elizabeth and it was very exclusive VIP. So you get picked up, you get dropped off. I worked there for a year and a half and the year and a half came and I became pregnant. By then I was 26 and in 3 months I found out I was pregnant with Summer. And because of the racism, I still continued to work and in 6 months it was in-house abortion. I was asked to after the abortion, I was asked to get back to work. When I was told to get back to work, I did. And then that was the time I said no. And that's how I got kicked out of the brothel. Ended up in the hospital and ended up in rehab. Being a 27-year-old girl in South Africa with a criminal record and with just basically the way South Africa was in that particular time during the apartheid of what you're supposed to have and what you're not supposed to have as a woman. And you're not having that, you are not even looked at through the system and the structures of government. You go to the clinic, you ask for condoms, you have to pay for it. You see the same police that came to raid the same brothel that you have by you. So basically, your confidential details to reach out and get assistance through the system never came through. Obviously, they got hold of me again and they used me for drug trafficking. And that was the second phase of my exit. Got back to Cape Town. My body started to show the diseases of the years of being trafficked and sexually exploited. Had to knock on the clinic doors, got to the clinic doors, got my HIV tested, and that's how I started to get to know other organizations. The first organization that assisted me was Embrace Dignity, and with Embrace Dignity, that's how I got the opportunity to read and write my book called Exit. And that was the story that ended up for me to travel around the world and be a global survivor leader today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for telling us your incredible story and your message about turning adversity into something positive. I am pleased to introduce our next speaker, Ms. Hye-Shin Park, an economist who joined the OECD in 2011. As the Gender Program Coordinator of the Network's Partnerships and Gender Division at the OECD Development Center, Ms. Park leads the gender team to explore how discriminatory social norms perpetuate gender inequalities and women's empowerment opportunities through the Social Institutions and Gender Index. She holds a master's degree in development economics from the London School of Economics and from the University of Paris #1. In order to develop effective VAWG prevention measures, we need to have a better understanding of the root causes of VAWG, and one is obviously to have a better understanding of men. So Ms. Park will speak to us on tackling masculine norms to prevent violence against women and girls. Ms. Park, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Linda. Thank you very much for everyone for being here and also having me here. And I would also like to thank Griselda to sharing your powerful story with us today as well. So yes, I'm Hye-Shin Park. I lead the gender team at the OECD Development Center. And today I really wanted to focus on our recent publication that's called Man Enough, measuring masculine norms to promote women's empowerment. But before that, I want to give a bit of overview. So even before the COVID-19 crisis, we all know that I'm here with actually experts, so I don't need to repeat this, but we knew that even before the COVID-19 crisis, 1 in 3 women experienced physical and or sexual violence at least once in their lifetime. And up to 70% of sexual assaults were committed by an intimate partner. And we have seen that during the COVID-19 crisis, the confinement, the lockdown, has become a breeding ground for domestic abuse. As early data and evidence show in both advanced and developing countries alike, the crisis exacerbated the prevalence of gender-based violence, as was also the case during the Ebola outbreak. Although addressing gender-based violence should really be at the central focus of the recovery efforts, we also need to understand that it is not going to go away with this coronavirus. For example, although the violence against women has been the universal issue and already in a pandemic, legal frameworks, it's not. Only 133 of the 180 countries covered by the SIGI, the Social Institutions and Gender Index, criminalize domestic violence, and just 100 countries treat sexual harassment as a criminal offense. And more shockingly, I want to also emphasize the fact that it's women's acceptance as well. About 30% of women globally think that violence can be justified in certain circumstances. For instance, if she burns the food, argues with her husband, or goes out without telling him, neglecting the children, or refusing to engage in sexual intercourse with them. Under these sort of circumstances, women themselves feel that wife beating can be justified. And there is a correlation between countries where domestic violence is condoned or accepted by a significant proportion of the population and high levels of prevalence of this crime. For instance, in Guinea, 92% of women justify spousal violence and 80% have suffered from violence against women. So it is clear that the prevalence of domestic violence is closely intertwined with the social acceptance of domestic violence. And this is why the OECD Development Center for more than a decade now has been providing this index called Social Institutions and Gender Index across 180 countries. With this measure, we do measure the discrimination that is embedded in our social institutions, what we call legal frameworks, social norms, and practices, which restrict women's and girls' rights. And the SIGI is actually the official source of monitoring SDG 5.1, together with the UN Women and the World Bank. While we were working on the SIGI, it was really to uncover the often hidden or invisible part of this iceberg as a drivers of gender inequality. And it became very natural to look at masculine norms as a next step to build on SIGI's analysis of social norms more generally. So since last year, well, actually since 2 years ago, we've been engaging with many partners who've been working on masculinities over the course of this work and have considered their important efforts in this area. And so last week, we have released this publication, Men Enough, Measuring Masculine Norms to Promote Women's Empowerment, which have basically 3 key messages: that there are some masculine norms, what we call restrictive, which hinder women's empowerment, but they don't need to be restrictive. They don't need to be harmful. We have another set of masculine norms that we want to promote, which is gender equitable. But obviously, to promote the gender equitable masculinities, we should be able to measure these norms, the restrictive norms, as the first step to transform them and to design better policies. So what do we call masculinities? They encompass the various socially constructed ways of being and acting, values and expectations associated with being and becoming a man in a given society, location, and temporal space. Masculinities are not just about describing men, and I want to emphasize that we don't use them as synonyms. It's rather, it's about our shared ideas about what men do and who men are, as well as what men should do and be. So they are both descriptive and prescriptive. And this is why we talk about masculinities in the plural form rather than masculinity. Doing global research, we know that there have been many different understandings, values, and expectations when it comes to manhood. There are also diverse masculinities within one society. In this publication, we have focused on two types of masculinities, what we call restrictive and gender equitable. Restrictive masculinities confine men to their traditional role as the dominant gender group, undermining women's empowerment and gender equality. On the other hand, gender equitable masculinities are supportive of women's empowerment and gender equality, and it undermines unequal gender power dynamic. We really choose this terminology to avoid normatively charged or judgmental language such as toxic, harmful, or even positive. So what the publication has identified is the 10 norms of restrictive masculinities, both in economic and political spheres and private sphere. And you can read it in the slides, I hope. And otherwise, you can also visit our website to have the to look at the publication. Today, what I want to emphasize more is the fact that the combination of these norms have direct consequences on women's and girls' empowerment. For instance, they do promote the devaluation of women's paid and unpaid labor, or it also limits women's agencies in all spheres of life. And as we speak today, it also leads to violence, especially when such norms are challenged. I would like to emphasize again that violence against women is not just an individualistic issue or the action of just some bad men. We believe that it is also a collective social problem rooted in the widely held social norms surrounding masculinities. Again, these norms are socially constructed notions about how men behave and, importantly, how they are expected to behave in specific settings to be considered real men. Some masculine norms, as I said, promote very rigid understandings of what it means to be a real man, and it puts pressures on men and boys as well to live up the ideals of a socially constructed idea of manhood. We found that indeed, the men who accept and internalize these norms are more likely to commit violent acts. So what are these norms? One such ideal is that real men have to be breadwinners and financial providers for their family. Across 28 EU countries in 2017, 43% of the respondents declared that the most important role of a man is to earn money, and it was up to 80% in Bulgaria. Moreover, in 2016 in Azerbaijan, a majority of men declared that a man who does not have an income is of no value. This belief that real men are breadwinners reinforces another central norm of restrictive masculinities, that they must earn more than their partners and have the final say in household decisions, including financial choices. And obviously, as society changes and evolves, the traditional role of men and women, meaning that men work for pay and women care for the home, are being increasingly challenged. And with women's economic empowerment and success in the economic sphere, it makes it even more difficult for men to live up the ideal of being the primary breadwinner or being financially dominant. In fact, on average, across 49 countries where we have data, nearly 37% of respondents declared that if a wife earns more money than their husband, it's definitely going to create a problem. Another restrictive masculine norm that plays a role for violence against women and girls is that men should have the final say when it comes to decision making at home. In 16 out of 25 countries where we have data, at least 2/3 of men agreed that a man should have the final word about decisions in this home. This attitude indicates an acceptance of male dominance in household decision making, and it has far-reaching implications for women beyond violence. A lack of say in household decision can prevent women from pursuing their goals, such as pursuing education, a career, or entrepreneurship. So combination of such norms have bearings on violence against women. One that I want to also note that is that it creates roadblocks for women, for victims, when they choose to leave abusive partnerships as well, especially when women lack access to and decision-making power over important assets. It really becomes very hard for victims to leave the partnerships or the household. Another important piece of this issue is the fact that most societies expect men to be strong and refrain from expressing their emotions. So men are left with few socially legitimized or accepted outlets, while anger and violence are simultaneously often accepted reactions from men and boys. This means that violence against women, and intimate partner violence specifically, can emerge as an outlet for the emotions and frustrations men feel when they are unable to live up to society's restrictive expectations. This also means that the macro changes such as the COVID-19 crisis have the potential to destabilize the lives of men by making it more difficult to live up to the demands of restricted masculinities, thus provoking violent reactions as we've seen during the pandemic. Hence, the goal is really to transform such restrictive masculinities into gender equitable ones, which will benefit both women and men and everyone. So, and I really would like to emphasize that this is not a zero-sum game that men loses and women gain. It will, going forward and promoting gender equitable masculinities, it will benefit everyone. But obviously this requires challenging unequal gender power dynamics, which are built on codified relations between men and women and on what it means to be a real man. As highlighted in our recent publication, masculine norms are transmitted also from generation to generation. We also know that men who grew up with their fathers or guardians beating their wife or women in their household are more likely to act violently when they become adults. I think I am having my final slide. So I just want to finally note that down that I'd just like to conclude with some of our recommendations, especially on collecting better data, because unless what we say at the OECD is that if it's not measured, there will be no progress. So we'd like to measure such norms, to what extent it is really widespread. And we also want to emphasize on the fact that it is not just men or women who should do it. It's not a women's issue either. We really need the whole of government or whole of society approach to end IPV or more broadly violence against women. And lastly, pushing back on social acceptance of violence, that will be very important. Hence, identifying educational programs that target harmful stereotypes and to support cultural change around such restrictive masculinities. I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Park, for giving us a thorough and interesting analysis of masculinity and the different types of masculine norms and how they impact women's empowerment, as well as create the inequalities that women have to live under. To conclude our event, we have asked Dr. Mohinder Watson, the main representative of the International Council of Women to UN Geneva, to share her incredible story with us. During the Beijing Plus 25 UNECE Regional Review, she co-chaired the Violence Against Women's Civil Society Working Group and also presented its recommendations to the regional meeting itself. She has a PhD in health sciences and a master's in public health, and she engages in research and advocacy against child marriage and related harmful practices. She's also the founder of NGO Action on Child, Early, and Forced Marriage in 2015. And she has also produced several research studies, and she produced the first comprehensive research study on child widows in 18 countries, and has just published a book chapter on child and temporary marriages in Afghanistan and Iran. Mohinder, you have the floor. Mohinder?
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm going to talk about a little bit about honor-based crimes and including a little bit on that on forced marriage. So we'll start with a quote from former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who stated back in 2014, although freedom from violence is a fundamental human right, millions of women and girls around the world are assaulted, beaten, raped, mutilated, or even murdered in what constitutes appalling violations of their human rights. As someone who has experienced and witnessed violence, I'd like to share some insights from growing up in a very strict Asian community and the mindsets I had to deal with. It is argued that the three most important life events will be your birth, your death, and your marriage. And usually we have very little control over our birth or death, but who we marry should be our choice. But it wasn't like that for me, especially once I became a teenager. My changing body shape from a young girl to a woman set off alarm bells ringing for my family. There was a potential risk that I might find a boyfriend, which would bring shame on my family. So they set about finding a husband for me, and at the age of 16, they succeeded. Although I protested against the marriage, no one listened. They said I was far too young to know what I wanted. Time passed, and one day I noticed that my family were buying in large quantities of alcohol and food. When I asked them what it was for, I was shocked to hear it was for my engagement party. Although I was afraid of the family, I repeated again that I don't want this marriage. This time I was given a very stern ultimatum: marry him or get out the house and don't come back. I faced an impossible choice. I was naive, I had no money, no support, but eventually I got a place at university, so education became my escape route. But many girls suffer tremendous mental and physical violence, which eventually takes its toll. I remember waking up early on a beautiful Sunday morning and being very excited because it was my cousin's wedding. I ran downstairs to my younger sister's bedroom and shook her to tell her to hurry up, let's get ready for this wedding. She didn't respond, but knowing how she liked to play games, I threw back her bed covers to annoy her, fully expecting her to throw something at me. But she didn't move. She didn't open her eyes. To my horror, I noticed that the mattress was wet and she was lying in a pool of urine. The reality slowly dawned on me. She was unconscious. She had taken an overdose of sleeping pills and tried to commit suicide. She was just 13 years old. A few more minutes and she would have died. Why would my 13-year-old sister want to end her life? She was a victim of honor-based violence, a set of punishments meted out to girls who don't conform to certain rules of behavior. In my sister's case, her crime was developing bad acne on her face, and she was covered in these tiny teenage spots, which everybody hates, and she tried her best to cover them with foundation cream. Unfortunately, my brothers thought she was wearing makeup to make herself more attractive to men. In reality, she was a self-conscious teenager, afraid of being teased at school by her friends. This demonstrates how a completely innocent act by a teenager can be misinterpreted under the guise of protecting family honor. We were brought up to know that family honor, or izzat, comes before everything else. From birth, a girl's body carries the burden of family honor. Males in the family feel it their duty to defend it, no matter what. A girl's every action, her every movement may be monitored, scrutinized, and controlled. What she wears, how she does her hair, her makeup, who she talks to. And punishments may include intimidation, social exclusion, acid attacks, abduction, beatings, and even killings. Some consider this to be a form of self-administered justice, and some of these events are planned by the family and often in collusion with the community. It has to be said, honor-based violence is hidden. Around 3/4 of the cases are never reported. And the triggers for honor-based violence are many. It can be refusing an arranged marriage, entering into a premarital or extramarital relationship, dressing in an unacceptable way, such as showing your arms, showing your legs, refusing to wear a hijab, wearing makeup, wanting to marry somebody outside the community. And in the case of this poor girl, Aisha, wanting to leave your violent husband. This terrible picture is of a 19-year-old girl, Aisha, who was mutilated by her husband. Thankfully, she has been able to have reconstructive surgery and rebuilt her life in America. But there are many terrible examples of what families will do in the name of family honor. We have the case of a 17-year-old teenager who was suffocated by her parents for exposing her bare arms. Shaphilia had suffered years of beatings at the hands of her parents before they eventually killed her in front of her siblings. She had brought dishonor to the family. She'd worn a short-sleeved top that showed off her arms. Her parents pinned their daughter down on the sofa and stuffed a plastic carrier bag into her mouth until she suffocated. Parents told police she'd run away from home, but her body was found 5 months later in a river. In another case, a 15-year-old girl, Tulay from London, was killed by her father for running away to live with her boyfriend. Her father kidnapped, drugged, and killed her. They disapproved of her boyfriend. Even though he was a fellow Turkish Kurd, he had different beliefs, and this was reason enough for her family to kill her. In a third case, an older woman, 25-year-old Samira, was murdered for wanting to marry somebody of her own choice. Samira was a graduate who was working as a recruitment consultant. She was killed while trying to escape from her family home after she'd rowed with them about her plans to marry an Afghan asylum seeker. Her 30-year-old brother dragged her back into the house where he and his 17-year-old cousin cut her throat and stabbed her to death 18 times in front of her 2 nieces. This gives you an idea of how serious, horrific, and violent this issue can be. But what can be done to combat honor-based violence? There is greater awareness now, but it's still largely a hidden issue. We need to implement strict laws and make sure they're enforced and provide access to justice for victims. We need to address the discriminatory social norms which allow this to happen. And we need to educate children and teachers in schools. We need to provide cultural sensitivity training for the judges, for police officers, for social workers. And we need to foster better community liaison between police and local communities. We need to provide systems for women to report, such as online and mobile apps. We need to engage in outreach activities and encourage women, police officers and men to go into mosques and gurdwaras to talk about violence against women. We need to provide survivor-centered care for them, such as shelters and healthcare, mental health care, and other support. We need to recruit more female police officers, and particularly those from ethnic backgrounds. And most importantly, with all victims, we need to treat victims with dignity, validate their experiences, and make sure we use trained police officers who understand the dynamics around honor-based violence. So what are some of the takeaway messages? Honor-based violence is hidden, but it is a form of gender-based violence, and we must address the social norms which perpetuate it. Violence against women, we know, in all its form is not new, it's centuries old, but it has been exacerbated by the recent pandemic. As we reset our future norms, it's really important that we also reset our future mindsets and commit to a zero tolerance policy to violence against women. Violence against women can never be justified, whether in the home, in the workplace, in schools, on the streets, online, or in conflict. Since the control of women's sexuality underlies many forms of violence against women, we must establish the principle of women's sexual autonomy and have robust legal systems to uphold it. As mothers and parents, we can teach our children to respect one another and about the importance of having healthy relationships, as such attitudes are formed at home long before our children go to school. We need to take a holistic approach involving religious leaders, men and boys, health workers, police, the media, teachers, judiciary, local communities, governments, all working together to end violence against women. I'd like to end with a quote from Antonio Guterres, UN Secretary General, who said, "Gender equality is a question of power, power that has been jealously guarded by men for millennia. We must urgently transform and redistribute power if we are to safeguard our future and our planet. That power includes freeing women all over the world from violence." As civil society actors, we have a responsibility to lobby our governments to implement and enforce policies to prevent and eliminate violence against women, so that at Beijing Plus 35 and in 2030, we can witness some real change. The global pandemic has offered a unique opportunity for us to take collective action to advance gender equality and end violence against women once and for all. Let's not waste this great opportunity and seize it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohinder, for your story and also for speaking on honor-based killings, which we only sometimes hear about in the news. One would expect that the family to be a source of support, and it is quite unthinkable that they can be a source of such incomprehensible violence. I would like to thank all the speakers for the wonderful presentations. Inasmuch as it is quite tragic that violence against women and girls has increased during the pandemic, we hope that the spotlight will lead to the incorporation of policies, measures, and practices to prevent and end violence in women into national and local recovery plans that will rebuild the world back better. As the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women has said, policies to prevent violence against women should be holistic, should be deemed as essential services based on the recognition that it is the human right of women to live free from violence, and that it is important for member states and the United Nations to come up with a global implementation plan to prevent violence against women and girls that can be adopted into national plans. On a positive note, as long as minds are set to provide protection measures, we see from the presentations today, the states and NGOs have shown their flexibility in devising myriad of ways for victims of violence against women to have access to services during the COVID-19 pandemic. These include the establishment of hotlines, e-protection orders, online and messaging hotlines, and turning vacant hotels into temporary shelters, etc. We are also so happy or so moved to hear Griselda and Mohinder stories. And we're happy that they're personally able to join us and tell these incredible stories, which highlight why it is so urgent to end violence against women and girls. Now it's time for the Q&A. And I see from the chat that we have some questions. Let me pose the first that I see for you. One question from Riya Medirata is, she's from Mumbai, India, and she asked, what are some steps that can be taken at an institutional level to ensure that men and women are not socially taught that violence against women is normal? Hyejin, can you take up this question?
Sure. Yeah, well, that is actually the question that we constantly try to answer. I think the answer, everyone knows that. It's just that it's very hard to implement. First of all, I think in any case, social changes, it doesn't happen in one day. And it also needs everyone's efforts men and boys, LGBTI, and everyone. And it also happens at the very individual setup, but obviously we believe at the OECD that policies and programs have its role to play as well. It's been, I think, at least within the OECD, it took some time to really think about intimate partner violence or gender-based violence to be taken up to the policy level or at the political level, because a lot of people actually thought that it was happening in a private sphere, so it's something that the governments or policies can never really intervene, but it's actually not the case. And this is now well received. And I think this is the first step that all the institutions or let's say authorities or political institutions would keep this in mind and then start addressing them and taking them into account their policy interventions. Then obviously there's a lot to be done. And I think it's here's what the grassroots organizations and your roles become very instinct and important, because social change also starts with your peer. If you see something in your community or household level, and then you do not do anything because it's socially accepted. We have done some city country studies in Burkina Faso and saw that even when a victim, and you see that with the neighbors, they just cannot go even to report to the justice system. Why? Because it's a community shame. So unless we really tackle these issues altogether, it's going to be very hard to eliminate all these things. I really hope that I answered some of them, but yes, it's something that we need to keep discussing.
Thank you, Hyejin. Also, Hillary, can we also ask you to comment on that, and also to speak about how we can put more pressure on governments to ratify and implement CEDAW? Hello, Hillary, are you there? I don't know where Hillary is, but we also have another question from South Korea, An Lee. She would like to know if there are any practical solutions for men sexually exploiting women in this COVID situation. Even in this contactless society, they can buy sex. Can anyone speak on that? Oh, Hinder, do you have, hi, Griselda, would you like to answer that one?
If you could just repeat it again, I think I just got the last part of that people could still also buy sex.
Yes, they would like to know if there are any practical solutions for men to stop men exploiting women sexually.
I think, as a survivor coming from sex trafficking into prostitution, it's all the demand. And in Africa and South Africa, the demand of men wanting that. And when there's a demand on a certain thing in anywhere in a country like South Africa or Africa right now, and who we are and where we stand in the world, there's this demand of more women, and people find there should be a sort of a level-headed right so everybody could choose what they want to do, but forgetting that the men are demanding younger and younger girls every day. So with that demand, in all the spaces, this is being marketed, spoke about. In churches, men speak about it. In bars, men speak about it. In taxi ranks, in social areas, cricket, World Cup, men speak about, I'm gonna go to a strip club or a basketball. So those are the spaces where we expect there should be this high-level political campaign and awareness and workshops that will be implemented all the way down to organizations. And I think also just for a community that really sees there's a lot going on in their community, like brothels, or younger and younger girls are becoming more and more pregnant, that awareness should be made clear with real productive health departments and to intervene, but also intervene in a way of this is what's happening. So women and girls get the rescue plan as much as they don't get out of it, but get that health care of rescue plan. So I think that should be the beginning of a conversation to assist.
Thank you, Griselda. We are almost running out of time. I think we have 1 minute left. I would like to ask Mohinder though, we have a question, is how widespread is honor-based violence? Mohinder?
Yeah. Hi, thank you. One of the things with honor-based violence is, as we've said, it's hidden. It's something that happens behind closed doors. I'll give you my own example. It's taken me over 30 years to even talk about it, you know, because these things, you feel they within your family, you don't talk to them, anybody outside. When you talk about honor, you're always talking about shame. Sorry about that. You're always talking about shame, which is the other side of it. So I think unless the conversations start where people meet, I mean, the next generation is far more open and they do talk about these conversations. In my parents' generation, they didn't. You just do as you're told and get on with it, and you're expected to abide by the rules of society. You find that the whole community takes part in watching girls. It's not just your family, it's much wider. And your parents are worried how this will affect their standing against other people when they see them on the Sunday in the temple, in the Gurdwara. But in terms of countries, India has a massive amount. This is fairly common. A lot of South Asian countries, Pakistan, we also see cases. The girl you saw that was mutilated was in Afghanistan. There are many countries where patriarchy is strong and women have their place. They should be in the kitchen, not outside. Unfortunately, that still exists. Male-dominant societies still want the male to be the breadwinner and the superior family member, and the rest just have to, women are just there to have the children and clean the house, and that's their role. There's a real division of labor. That's changing with the next generation. But I think it's going to be very hard to change in societies where it's deeply ingrained and where the whole society is based around this. I mean, if I think about our society, it's all based around this whole culture of honor. And you spend your whole life treading on eggshells that you don't do anything wrong that would bring shame on your family. And this happens to many, many girls, millions of girls. I mean, I think the UN reports several thousand are killed a year, but I would imagine most of the cases never get out. We used to, growing up, we would hear whispers of some girl had been killed. I think my sister's friend was murdered. She was pushed out the window by her family and nothing came of it. They just said, oh, well, she was cleaning the windows and she just slipped. If there's no evidence, the community closes in. There's a conspiracy of silence. You know, we heard a lot of things. That's partly what kept us under control, the fear. The fear keeps the other girls under control. So it's a very, very complex question, not that one that can't be answered easily. I think time will be a big help with the younger generation on much broader social media. I think that's going to help get information passed around. And I think you really need leadership from the top. I think people lower down are not able to take the action. You really do need political will to bring about change. I'm sorry if I've gone over. There's no easy answer, basically, but
yes,
you know, it really is going to need political will and funding, of course, like everything. Nothing happens without money. But education, and I think that gets right down to mothers at home, right at the start. I think, like my brothers, it was too late. They came from India in their teens. This masculinity had already been inbuilt, and then they just used it in the UK. So I think we have to start early And this is where parents come in at home, even before our children go to school. Does that help?
Yes, thank you very much, Mohinder. I'm afraid time is, we've gone over our time by 4 minutes. And so we will probably, we might lose our connection anytime. But I would like to thank all our presenters and for joining us. I know that Hillary and Griselda joined us under difficult circumstances because their powers were being cut off, and Hillary had to leave early. Or her power, she lost her power. And so she wasn't able to answer any question for us. And I would really like to thank our incredible speakers. And I'd also like to thank our audience for your participation today in our event. And I think we can all take away from this event the importance of collecting data, the importance of, actually more important, to get men into the conversation and also to get men involved in finding the solutions, and that we all have to start from early education to change the social norms and to change old masculinity norms and to create new ones. Well, thank you very much for attending our event today. It was really a great event. I enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Dr. Kim, please, would you like to say something?
Thank you very much for your great effort, Linda, to make this event very successful. And also, I'd like to express my gratitude to all the speakers and also participants for their staying until the end of this event. Thank you so much. Thanks to your great effort, I'm so happy to be able to make our event very, very successful. I think so. So I can, I can see the message from National Council of, such as the National Council of Turkey, Indonesia, and many of our sisters. So nice to be with you here. And I really hope that all of you are staying healthy and safe in this difficult time of the COVID-19. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Park. That was a very good presentation. I learned a lot.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you, Griselda. It was so moving to hear your story. And we hope we will learn more about what you've been doing in the future.
Yes, definitely. I would love to share that. People can just go on info.survivorexit.org for the book, or get the details. You can get the book.
Okay, maybe you could type that into the chat. Some people
Yes.
will be able to access that. Thank you. Thank you to our sisters from the National Council of Women who joined.
Yeah, we had a good turnout. Some of them came.
Yeah, we might all still be on.
We are, and I think we'll get cut off.
Yes, anytime. But
anytime soon. So hard to guess.
Yes. Thank you, Jong
minute.
Suk, for arranging this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Linda, for holding it all together. I mean, that's what kept it together.
Thank you, Mohinder. Thank you, Mohinder.
Thank you, Mohinder.
For your effort for success of our event. Thank you.
But don't ask me to do it again.
Leslie Wright from the US. Are you still?
Oh, we have a Manu.
Leslie Wright. Yeah, I can see her name here. Leslie Wright.
She's your friend, right?
Yes. Yes. If she, can yeah. I
One
want,
of the
I want to speak
participants.
something. Leslie. Oh, maybe she has left.
I think Patricia Masnuk wanted
Yeah,
to speak, say something
many of
too.
participants have already left. So we'd
Yeah.
better, in 1 minute, we'd better,
Let's see.
finalize. Oh, Leslie Light.
I'm still here. Oh,
Oh,
she's Hi,
Leslie,
Leslie.
oh, yeah. She expressed her appreciation to Mohinda.
No, I just, she'd heard me speaking.
Thank you very much for the desktop with attending this conference. It's the most amazing resource. I've always desired to have it as a survivor. And just being here and having a desktop, which is a source of resource for my community, is such a privilege. So thank you so much for funding that. Just in this event, as a survivor, I can work on my second book. I can help other young girls with their school education because of this desktop. So I really just want to say thank you to all of you for all chipping in and getting it in Kailicha, which is the most highest and dangerous drug in violence.